Yes, as Serene mentioned, I am Katie McFarland and I'm located in Idaho. And I don't know about you guys, but it has gotten really cold here really quickly. It was about 17 at my house this morning, which is warmed up a little. So whenever it's chilly like this, my mom used to always say, well, the best way to warm up the house is to bake something and heat up your oven. And we are going to be talking about baking today. I'm going to show you guys how to make a healthy, delicious, and easy whole grain bread. Now, it's called artisan bread. What does that mean? It simply means that it is handcrafted in small batches. So if you want to get fancy, you could say every dinner you make is artisan if you're doing it by hand in a small batch, unless you're feeding a lot of people. So artisan bread doesn't make any difference in textures or flavors or quality or nutrition. It just talks about how it's made in a small batch. So we are going to learn about a whole grain artisan bread today. Before we get started though, because you guys want to get in them drying, we're going to do our poll real quick. If we can find it. I had trouble finding it last week.
Yeah, I don't see. I see grains galore.
There we go.
Okay. Okay, I think it looks like everyone has answered. Only have a few more. We'll give it a few more minutes. Now we do have someone that said that they do not see a poll, but we do have responses.
It seems like Zoom changes its formatting every week.
Okay. So those are the results of our poll. So we have a few people that have come joined us before. Some people have not. And we have, it looks like a majority no experience with making artisan bread.
Well, then this is the perfect recipe.
So Katie, if that pulls up on your screen, it's because you have to close it on your individual one, but we have removed that poll. So.
Perfect. All right, so most of you have not ever made an artisan bread before, so you've come to the right place. This recipe is what I call the busy person's bread because you can have fresh homemade bread with very little input, which whenever I think of making bread, it's like this long drawn out process that requires a lot of work. And this one is quick. It's a mix together recipe, which means there's no kneading. So you don't have to spend that time kneading and have that kind of, it's almost an art to kneading to know exactly when your bread's the right texture for whatever you're baking. And so we skip that guesswork. You don't have to worry about that. This is just a mix and go type recipe. In fact, my 10-year-old daughter loves making bread with this recipe. It's really easy and she loves to show off that she can bake bread. So this is even a 10-year-old can do it type bread. We can make this really easy. So I've mentioned that it is also very healthy. Now that is because we have no added sweeteners to this bread, which is awesome because a lot of the breads that you purchase in the store have a lot of hidden sugars. So if you're watching your sugar intake, this bread is going to be great for that. It's a majority of whole wheat flour. So that means that this is a whole wheat product, which is super important because you're getting the entire grain. So if we have a wheat grain and we are going to process it, we can take the entire grain, grind it up into flour, and that's whole wheat flour. Or we can take the wheat grain and we can strip that outside off and only process the inside. and that produces a white flour. So when we remove that outside, that husk, we're losing fiber and tons of vitamins and minerals. So it's really important that we choose more whole grains than processed grains, because the USDA recommends that half of the grains we eat every day be whole grains. And this is a great way to get your whole grains. Last week, Katie Hickok talked about the importance of beans for fiber in our diet. This is also going to be a great source of fiber for you with that whole wheat. It's a great way for me to sneak in fiber with my kids because they don't always love whole wheat stuff. But this bread is really versatile and can make a really great product, and you can mix it up and it's very forgiving. So like I said, this is going to be the easiest bread recipe that you've ever seen. So we're going to get our fiber, which we talked about last week is important for our digestion. It's important for reducing cholesterol. It's important for heart health. Plus, we're going to get those extra antioxidants, which are really important as well. So we're going to pack all that in here. It has very little salt, so it is a low sodium product, and it doesn't have much else in it. However, it's not gluten-free, and I know we've talked about that. We'll actually talk about even adding gluten to this, but I'll explain that as we go through the process. You guys are all going to receive the recipe that I'm going to demonstrate for you guys today, so you'll be able to replicate this and know exactly what you're doing. But I'm going to walk through the process and talk about the ingredients as we go so that you can see it, because the most important part I feel with this recipe is kind of knowing the steps. The recipe that I sent you is pretty formal. It's actually been reduced from the original recipe I was taught because it made it so formal. It almost seemed like you had to follow everything exactly or it wasn't going to turn out. And I was always stressed out about it and not doing it right. And it turns out that you can do this really simply, and it's very forgiving. So we'll talk about ways that you can mix things up and things that are okay if you miss or don't do exactly, so that you don't have to feel like this is a big fancy project. This is something super simple and easy that you can do so you can have fresh bread for the next 2 weeks if you'd like. So the recipe you're going to get will make 4 loaves. The loaves are about this big. So that will feed my family. I have 4 kids. That'll feed us 1 dinner. So if I want any extras, I have to bake 2 loaves at a time. You can bake all 4 at a time, or you can save the dough in the refrigerator for later, which is really awesome. If you only want to use 1/4 of your dough, bake 1 loaf, you can put the rest of it into your fridge and keep it for up to 14 days. I like to use a container like this to do that with a lid. Or if you don't have a fancy container like this from a restaurant store, I also use a 1-gallon ice cream bucket from the store as well. Those work great. Or if you have a Tupperware, it's not going to expand in the fridge, so you don't have to worry about it popping the lid off. So it's okay as long as you just have a sealable container that you can pop it in the fridge, like I said, for up to 14 days. So the first thing we're going to get started with in the bread is our flour. As I mentioned, this is a whole grain, so we're going to be using whole wheat flour. Now, just because the flour is brown does not mean it's whole wheat. So make sure that it's a whole wheat and not just unbleached flour. So our whole wheat flour is going to take 5.5 cups. And I already put that into my bowl. And then it takes 2 cups of all-purpose flour. My kids at first, when I started making this, really weren't into that heavy texture because a lot of kids aren't really into whole grain stuff. So I reduced some of the whole wheat and added in a little bit more white flour. Now you're going to get a finer texture and you're going to get less chew, which is things I love about bread, but little kids don't love so much. But you're going to also reduce a little bit of your nutrition as well. So make sure that you have some whole wheat in there for sure. Otherwise, it's not going to be whole wheat bread anymore. But you can always take back a little bit of the whole wheat if it's just too much for your palate and you want it to be a little bit finer, a little bit less nutty flavor, and a little bit less chew to it. So we're going to have our whole wheat and our unbleached flour. So there is 7.5 cups of flour in this bowl right now. Now, this is how easy this is going to be to put together. The next thing we're going to add is our granulated yeast. We're going to take a tablespoon and a half of that. I already have it measured out, so I'm just going to throw it in here. And we're going to mix up all our dry ingredients before we add our wet, which is just water. We're going to take our kosher salt. Now, if you want to make sure that it is a kosher salt, if you're following the recipe, because if you add a tablespoon and a half of regular table salt, you're going to have way too salty of a product. This is a coarser grained salt, so it's going to go a little farther. So if you have to use table salt, go ahead and reduce the amount that you're going to put inside that bread. Otherwise, it'll end up too salty. So we're going to put our tablespoon, sorry, I said tablespoon and a half, but a tablespoon of our kosher salt. So you can always pull this back a little bit, but salt is important because it does tend to bring out other flavors. So if you do it without salt, you can, but you're going to have a more bland tasting bread. So you can experiment with that and keep that in mind. And that's what's great about this bread. Again, the flour, you can mix it up. You can mix up your salt content, see if you like that. An important ingredient, though, is that our vital wheat gluten. Now, vital wheat gluten, we're going to add a 1/4 cup of that. All it is, gluten is a natural product. It is part of our grains. A lot of our grains naturally have gluten, and gluten is the glue that kind of binds together. That's why when you're making gluten-free products, you've got to add some other binder to it because it's not going to stick together. So in a yeast bread like this, that gluten is going to hold together so we get those nice air bubbles and the gases aren't released. And if you release too many gases, then you're going to have a very dense, hard loaf. But if you have that gluten to hold those gases inside, that's where you're going to get the lightness and the bubbles and the holes inside of your bread that you see. So you definitely want to make sure that you have that binding. Because we're not kneading this and we're not working that flour to bring out the more gluten and stronger bonds, we're going to add some vital wheat gluten. This can be purchased in your grocery store. My grocery store here has it sometimes, but I live in a very rural area. So if you have a bigger grocery store available, it'll be easier to find. But that is also going to be our prize for today, is a bag of vital wheat gluten. I get it at our Amish store here in town, and I will mail that to you guys for the winner of the survey from this week. So that'll be announced next week. But our vital wheat gluten is going to be important because that's the piece that's going to hold our bread together and give us that nice fluffiness. So our 1/4 cup of our vital wheat gluten. Now that's all my dry ingredients. That's it. No, like I said, no sugar. We're going to mix this up so that our yeast and gluten and salt is evenly distributed in with our flours, because you don't want pockets of salt, that's for sure. But mix that up so it's evenly incorporated. And now we're going to add our 4 cups of lukewarm water. You don't want it too hot, because if you have hot water, you're going to kill your yeast. If it's too cold, it'll take a long time for your yeast to activate and for your bread to rise. So this is where things get a little bit sticky, literally, because you're going to have a very sticky dough once you mix your water in. And it's going to be a little bit challenging to mix. Now, this is her least favorite part, she says, because it gets hard to mix everything in. So we're going to mix everything in, and I'm going to do it as quickly as I can, so you guys aren't staring at me on camera for an awkward amount of time while I mix this in. And while we're at it, I can always answer some questions while we wait for this dough to come together, because it does take a little bit of elbow grease. I love restaurant supply stores. That's where I call this my lunch lady spoon, because it's this big giant lunch lady type spoon, but they are excellent for this recipe because it gives you a little bit more leverage. So I'm going to show you guys a little bit right here. You can see how it's coming together as a dough. So it's going to be very sticky. I see we have a question about the definition of artisan bread. That is just saying that it is a small batch that is handcrafted. So nothing too fancy, nothing that means it has any sort of different in nutrition or anything like that. Just anything small. So any batch of bread you bake at home is an artisan bread. So it doesn't have to be anything too fancy. We'll talk a little bit about the fancy stuff when we get to the making of our loaf. All right, I've about got this stuff whipped into shape here. I do like to mix it in a bowl because it's easier to sneak into those corners and get that flour that's hiding out. If you mix it in a square container like this, it's going to be more challenging to get in those corners. So I love those containers for storing, but they're not so great for mixing. Even the ice cream tubs aren't the best for mixing it because it does have that little straight edge on the bottom. So I have some dough created here. That one came together really nice. Thank goodness. Sometimes it doesn't cooperate when you're on camera. So here is our dough. As you can see, it's firm. It looks pretty sticky. It is sticky. So it's going to be a little bit hard to handle at this stage. But if you refrigerate it, it's going to be easier to handle. So now what do? I've mixed up my dough. That's it. That's as simple as it is to get your bread started. Now, what we would do is we would let this sit for 2 hours. That's going to give that yeast an opportunity to mix in with the water, get activated, and start working. Now we're going to give it 2 hours for it to rise, and it will get a lot bigger. It won't quite double in size, but it'll get a lot bigger. Then at that point, you have 2 options. You can bake or you can put it in the fridge. So if you're going to let this, we're imagining in our time warp here that it's been 2 hours and we've let this dough rise. It's still going to be sticky. It's just going to be a little bit bigger in size, but it's still going to be pretty much the same consistency. And we're going to get ready to bake. So we need to shape our loaves. Now, these are free-form loaves, which means you're not using a pan, and you're just going to shape that kind of however you want. And yes, rest for 2 hours at room temperature. So I'm going to take, now these are a handy little tool. This is a bread scraper. You can get these at a lot of cooking stores. This one's flexible. You can get some that are a little more firm, but I love these things for working with this bread recipe because like I said, it's very sticky. So I'm going to cut off with my scraper about 1/4 of this dough. And my scraper is just going to pick it up nice and easy for me. And I'm going to set it on my pan. Now, it happened to come out of the bowl in a great little shape. And I'll show you guys that. It came off really lovely in a nice little loaf shape. Now, you can shape it round. You can shape it football shaped. I tend to make mine long and skinny. It cuts easier with my kids. So it's easier for dinner time. If you want to make something that's a little prettier, I do prefer the round. I think it looks prettier, but if you're just going for utilitarian, this is going to be gone in 5 minutes anyway, I go ahead and do a longer loaf because it makes for more even slicing. But either way, however you want to do it, you don't want to mess with your dough too much. So we're not going to play with it. We're not going to do a lot of shaping. Like I said, I use my scraper and I can just kind of maneuver it around a little bit to get it the shape I want. So now I have this nice football shape. I'm hoping it's as sticky as I think it is and it doesn't flop right off this, but it's my nice little football shape. Now, if I'm going to bake this, I'm going to let this little fella rest. If I just made it today, 2 hours to the tray, and now I'm going to bake it. I'm going to give it 40 minutes to go ahead and raise again. So a lot of bread recipes will call for a second raise once you put it in the pan. That's exactly what we're doing, giving it that second raise. Now, I told you guys this bread is really forgiving. So if it's not exactly 40 minutes, you're going to be okay. If it's less than 40 minutes, you're going to get a denser product. If you give it a little bit more than 40 minutes, it's going to be a little bit lighter, but it's not going to raise a whole ton. In fact, if you forget about it sitting on your counter for 2 hours and you don't come back for 4, it's going to be okay. It's not going to overflow and take over your kitchen like some kind of crazy sourdough starters tend to do. It's going to just stay in your bowl and it's okay. It's very forgiving. So now the dough is going to rest. You do not have to cover it while it is resting. As you notice, I placed it on a piece of parchment paper. This makes it really easy to, it is a little sticky on the bottom, so it makes it really easy to get off your pan. I am just using a regular baking sheet for this. You can use a stone. When I was taught the recipe originally, they used a baking stone or like a pizza stone. They're great. They tend to make a crustier product. So depending on what you'd like, but you can experiment with what you have at home. I am a fan of simple and easy things we don't have to go out and buy new things for, that we can just experiment with in our home with what we have. And so I just use a baking sheet at home. Use what you have on hand and you're comfortable with, but a cookie sheet works just as well. Now, again, time warping ahead 40 minutes, and we've let this sit. We're going to get ready to put it in the oven. And there's 2 things we're going to do that. We're going to take a very sharp knife, and we are going to slice the top of our bread. And it will cut the dough. It shouldn't just drag. So make sure it's sharp enough to cut. And you will see, I put 3 slices across. You can do different patterns with that. This one that I made earlier is just the 3 slices across. Now, this isn't just for decorative purposes. This is important to allow that steam to exit your bread. If you don't slice it, or you slice it before you let the 40 minutes happen and then put it in the oven, you're going to get a misshapen loaf that's exploded on one side or the other because that steam doesn't have anywhere to escape. So by cutting this, you're breaking that surface tension on your loaf, and it's going to allow that steam to come out. So that's going to be really important if you're going for a pretty loaf of bread. got to make sure you want to cut it. And that is using something very sharp is going to be more effective, because if you have a dull knife, it's just going to drag the dough across and it doesn't have the same effect. Now, this is where you have some variation. If you want your bread to be very crusty, then you will take a brush, dip it in water, and you will wipe water over top of your bread. This isn't necessary. If you don't do it, which I will tell you the truth, I don't do it most of the time. Again, though, I'm feeding small children who don't even like crust in general. So we got to make it as palatable as possible because we're sneaking nutrition in on them, right? And so you're going to take your brush, dip it in water, and then wipe it over your loaf. And then you're going to take a pan, and I tell you to either use something disposable, or you have that like one gross pan that's like the whatever pan. You don't really use it for baking cakes or anything like that because it's kind of looking nasty. I like to use that as my broiler pan. So whatever you have, either a disposable or a broiler pan, something you don't want to necessarily use something nice because it tends to get yucky. But you're going to put a cup of water in it and put it in the oven when you put your dough in the oven. That's going to create more steam inside of your oven. And that steam and the moisture on your bread is what's going to give you the crust. So if you want to maintain that very crusty bread, moisture is the key to that. So that's going to be the water on top and the steam in your oven. Again, you don't have to do that. It's totally fine to not do that. And you'll still get, this one was done on a cookie sheet without the water and without the broiling, and it turned out just fine. So, but it's again, your personal preference, what you have time for, what you want to experiment with. So if you'd like it crustier, you go ahead and do that. Now you're going to put it in a 400-degree oven for 35 minutes. And that's going to be how long it takes to bake your dough. 30 to 35. My oven takes a little bit longer. It takes 35. But then your bread will look like this. It's nice and brown. I don't have over browning on the bottom. As you can see, these are solid. These are not like squished. I mean, there's give, but it's not a squishy, mushy white bread that's just kind of all over the place. These are nice, hearty bread. These are amazing to toast up in the toaster or to put on a sheet and broil in your oven with a little bit of butter and garlic salt or something like that. They're great with jam or jelly, but it's a really nice heavy loaf. Ooh, doing it in an air fryer. That sounds exciting. I've never tried that, but I might have to try that. I haven't tried it. You can experiment with that. It might work. I don't know. I haven't ever tried it, but okay. So I have another question about if you don't like heavy bread, what's the best process? Let it rise. Make sure you have good fresh yeast. Make sure you have enough yeast. You're not cutting your measurement short, and you're giving it time to rise. That will give you more fluff. That will give you more air. That will make it less dense. And again, I would skip the water in the oven if you want it to be a little bit lighter on the outside as well. So that's the recommendation for that. Now, if I were to take this dough and it has been in the refrigerator, like I said, for up to 14 days, and now I want to bake it, you're going to do almost the exact same process, except after you shape it, you're going to give it an hour and a half. You don't, it's cold, and that yeast is going to need more time to get up to temperature and get ready to do its thing and give you that little bit of extra rise after you shape. So make sure that you give it a little bit of extra time if you're pulling it straight out of the fridge. So again, you can bake this in 4 loaves, or you can bake 2 at a time, or you can just bake 1 and then go ahead and divvy it out throughout the week. So I'm going to show you guys what this looks like on the inside so you can kind of see. My kids are going to be like, Mom, why did you tear this bread in half? But this is what it looks like. It's really nice. It's still fluffy. It's got a nice, good texture, and you can eat it just like this. It's really great. I love this bread. I especially think it's great for breakfast because it's very hearty and very filling. You can do some variations on this bread. So you get the basics down, you get the texture, what you like, and you want to mix it up. One thing I like to do is I like to put sesame seeds on top. I do that before it rises while the dough is a little more sticky, and they'll stick better. So if you want to top it with something, do it right after you shape your loaf. Oh, perfect timing. Ariel asked the question right at the same time I was answering it. Sesame seeds, I've done flax. You can do sunflower seeds. I've done sunflower seeds. That's really yummy. If you want to add something inside your bread, you can do that. I wouldn't recommend more than a 1/4 cup of whatever that is. I've done garlic. I have done sunflower seeds in the bread. I've done flax in the bread. Again, that's a little bit more of your fiber content that you're upping there, but it's really delicious. I've even added cinnamon and raisins to this, but the caveat to that is don't get your raisins on the top because in the 400-degree oven, those suckers will just like turn into little caramelized rocks on top. So if you're doing raisins inside, make sure nobody's exposed to the outside of the oven and they'll stay nice and moist and edible. Ones on top are not edible. So I've mixed cinnamon in it. You can do herbs in it if you want to do some thyme or rosemary, anything like that to give it a little bit of a difference. Maureen's asking if you could use olives. You could probably use olives. Then I would make sure that it's refrigerated when you store it. That's a whole nother thing too about storing it. If you don't eat the whole loaf, which I have to kind of remember, if you don't eat the whole loaf, you can store it in a brown paper bag and that will keep the crustiness. Now, if you don't like the crustiness, like I mentioned with my family, I just keep it in a resealable plastic bag. So there is the option to do that. Oh, great point about the cinnamon. Don't put too much in it because it'll inhibit the rise. So light on the cinnamon and keep those raisins tucked inside.
Katie, you do have a question about have you ever added cheese?
Oh, perfect. Cheese. I have done cheese on top, but I've never done cheese inside of it. But again, I wouldn't, especially with a moist ingredient like cheese, I wouldn't do more than a quarter cup because that's going to start to break up your bread and it's not going to hold together as well.
And Katie, I know that when you demonstrated making this very simple recipe for us today, you did use a dough scraper, and there was a question if you can shape with no scraper.
Oh yeah, totally. I have one that's much smaller at home that I use, and so it's completely different. You can shape it with your hands. There's absolutely no problem with that. I'll show you. You can just give it. You just kind of got to give it a little tuck here and a little tuck there. Like I said, it's going to be really sticky, so you're going to get it on your hands. But I can shape my dough into this nice, cute little round loaf just with my hands. So again, no special tools necessary. My nice big lunch lady spoon, it'll also work to shape it. Either way, it's fine. You don't have to have anything special. You can also, if you don't have parchment paper, you can also put cornmeal down on your pan and then put your dough on top, and that'll also help release it from the pan without it sticking and not having to use something like an oil or something on the bottom. So
Great.
yeah, we're
Thank you,
bake
Katie.
this little bread. Yes, ma'am.
There is one more question. If I don't like a heavy bread, what is the best process?
Right. So that's the yeast. You're going to make sure you definitely let it rise for the appropriate amount of time. So definitely hit your 2 hours before it goes in the fridge or bakes. Definitely hit that 40 or 90 minutes, depending on where it's coming from, after you shape it. And then don't add water to the top or put water in your broiler. One thing I like to do if I feel like it's going to be a little bit too crusty is I like to give it a little bit of butter on the top right when it comes out of the oven, and that'll kind of help keep that top softened. I see a question about could you flour your hands when shaping the dough so it doesn't stick? You totally can. Again, I am all about the quickness, and like you, it depends on how sticky your dough is. This one isn't too sticky, so I didn't get too messy doing it. Sometimes if you got a little bit too much water in there, it's awfully sticky, and it does make it a little harder to shape.
Katie, you have another question about do you cover when you're resting your dough?
Yeah, you do not have to cover your dough when it's resting. You can just let it sit. The 2 hours, you can throw a dish towel over it, but you don't have to seal it with saran wrap or anything like that. So it'll just, it forms a small crust on top, but it's not like when you're making rolls or something where that little bit of crust causes a problem later. It doesn't have a problem with this since it's very moist. It mixes right in and you don't end up with a tough spot. So that's all I have to tell you guys about this super easy bread. I told you it was this amazing, super easy bread that's healthy for you. It tastes delicious. It looks beautiful, wrapped up in parchment with a little twine tie on it to gift to people. And you can whip out 4 loaves at a time. So it's a really efficient use of your time. But I am happy to answer anyone's questions they have about this process that we went through. If you have any more questions I haven't gotten to.
We'll give people just a moment to think about their questions. You whipped through so many pieces so quickly, showing us how easy it is. So that's great. I know that I'm still digesting a little bit, but I already know in the chat someone shared, sounds like part of dinner tonight, and you showed us how easy it would be to incorporate that. So that's wonderful. So in the chat, there is a question that came in about using mini loaf pan.
I've never baked it in a pan. And so that's going to give you a different crusting. If you go ahead and put it in a pan, you're going to end up with a little bit different outside because it's going to have that pan to heat up around the outside. Like I said, this bread is very versatile. I don't imagine you having a problem baking it in a mini loaf pan. It's just one more step for me, one more set of dishes, right? So again, you can make it as easy or as complicated as your lifestyle and needs fit.
So Katie, I have a question. I know earlier you did say obviously what you're making today isn't gluten-free, but have you ever made gluten-free artisan bread?
I have a colleague of mine taught when we would teach this class, she would teach a gluten-free version. And I was gluten-free for a period of time and I did make gluten-free bread. The recipe is going to be very, very different. I have tried substituting a gluten-free flour in this recipe. And then, but again, you don't have that stickiness when you add that vital wheat gluten. So leaving the vital wheat gluten out does tend to make a denser product. So you have to use some other binder in it. I do have that recipe available, which I can add to this recipe if anyone is interested that we could send out along with this one. But it's going to be a very different process.
I'm very interested because I want to try to eat some.
Try it. I know. I know. Well, you should be here smelling it. You guys don't have smell-o-vision.
I know that's how it was when I made donuts for the class.
Sit here and eat like this loaf. Once I get off camera, it smells so good. And that's another great thing about baking bread. It makes your house smell amazing.
Yes. And I see Rhonda agrees. She wants to hear about gluten-free as well.
Perfect. I will add that. We can certainly have that recipe added when we send out this one because we do that with our materials after class. Am I correct, Serene?
Yes, we give it just a couple of days. And so so if you attend these live sessions, you get an immediate email with reminder for that survey and that opportunity for that raffle. And then we also, a few days later, once that video is available via YouTube, we send an email out to all registrants with the materials and a link to the YouTube video so that you could watch the presentation again. So.
Perfect. So those of you who want to bake tonight, do you have your basics down for the amount of ingredients and how long you bake it so that you can bake it tonight? Because I can run through those. We have time to do that, and you guys can jot those down if you need to. If you're very motivated to make this today.
And Katie, I can include it in the email today to attendees.
Perfect.
I can definitely.
Oven temperature is 400 degrees. I see a question on that. So 400 degrees, 30 minutes. And so you're going to have your mix, 2-hour rise, shake, 40-minute rise, bake in a 400-degree oven for 30 minutes.